And because IVF involves so often, not always, but so often, the destruction of embryos, the indefinite freezing of embryos, the abandonment of embryos, people who are pro-life should rightly say, wait, we have to care about their protection too. These are people too. We can't just say that embryos have a right to life when they're inside of the womb, but embryos in a lab don't. Again, then we've just completely imbibed this pro-choice idea that these are just clumps of cells that don't have value, that don't have rights because of their location. And so I don't see it. I don't see the ability to be pro-life and to have abortion or the anti-abortion logic that we do as pro-lifers and say, yeah, IVF should just keep going as unregulated as it is. Yeah, you should be able to create as many, freeze as many, transfer as many embryos as you want because, well, we're pro-baby. No, that's not a thoughtful position. I also don't believe that that is a biblical position because we are placing the wants of adults over the well-being of these tiny human beings. And again, that is anti-pro-life. However, most people have not thought about this. Most people haven't thought about this subject. And I understand that. I do. It's not like I have always been this passionate about this. There was a time just a few years ago where I also didn't really know what to think about all of this. I also thought of IVF as just a thing that people did to have babies. And I love babies. And I want people who want to be parents to be able to have kids. And wow, the yearning for a child, especially when that yearning is not fulfilled, when that longing can't be met, that is so heartbreaking, unimaginably difficult. And so if IVF allows someone who wants to be a parent to have children, isn't that wonderful? Shouldn't I be on board with that? But that was before I really started thinking about it. That was before I knew about the IVF process. That was before I knew about the ethical quandaries that so many parents are put in when they've created so many embryos and they don't know what to do with the leftovers. And I understand that's not everyone's story. Maybe you're listening and you're like, well, we transferred all of our embryos. We only created 3. We transferred all 3. Look, I still think that there are ethical and moral questions about conceiving outside of the womb and the risk of failure of transfer and the burden that that places on the embryo. But of course, I think that is the better option. But that is the minority. That is the minority. In the vast majority of cases, you're creating more embryos than you actually ever plan to transfer or implant. And so many frozen embryos are left over. And these are all people made in the image of God. And when I see that, and when I see how the reproductive industry profits off of all of this, and I see the consequences that the whole process actually has on female bodies, I have a lot of now fervor for talking about a subject that most evangelicals just won't touch. And I just want us to be more thoughtful on it, even though I feel sometimes like I and just a few other people are kind of alone, like in the pro-life evangelical world when it comes to talking about this, and certainly on the Republican side. And I'm going to read you some of the takes from Republicans over the past few days who have realized, ooh, this is unpopular. And because we want to win an election, we're going to make sure that we say, yay, IVF is awesome. Donald Trump came out in support of IVF several days ago. He said, let's see, I don't want to read this whole thing. He said, like the overwhelming majority, this is on Truth Social, of Americans, including the vast majority of Republicans, conservatives, Christians, and pro-life Americans, I strongly support the availability of IVF for couples who are trying to have a precious baby. Today, I'm calling on the Alabama legislature to act quickly to find an immediate solution to preserve the availability of IVF in Alabama. Look, even though I am against IVF and I've done several episodes on it, and I could spend this entire episode going into all the reasons why, even though I've already articulated some of the reasons why here. Go back and listen to those previous episodes and you can hear that. But even though I am against all cases of IVF, I would be happy moving in the direction of, say, Europe or New Zealand or Australia, where you can't just create all of these frozen embryos and then do whatever you want with them. I would be happy moving in the direction of protecting those embryos while also maybe allowing the transfer and the freezing of one embryo at a time. Italy doesn't even allow you to freeze the embryos. You have to transfer them immediately. Again, I would be happy moving in that direction, but maybe this will cause state legislatures to actually thoughtfully consider this issue and ensure that there are at least some protections in place for these tiny embryos. Nikki Haley, not surprising at all that she is kind of flip-flopped on this. So at first she says embryos are life, but she's also in favor of more IVF clinics. So here's SOT 1.
I mean, embryos to me are babies. So
even those created through IVF.
I mean, I had artificial insemination. That's how I had my son. So when you look at, one thing is to have to save sperm or to save eggs, but when you talk about an embryo, you are talking about, to me, that's a life. And so I do see where that's coming from when they talk about that.
Okay. So I agree with her on that embryos are life. Of course, when you have an embryo in your womb and you see that you're pregnant, you say that you are having a baby, but we change the terminology, it seems like, or the pro-abortion side does, or even some pro-life, pro-IVF advocates change the terminology when it comes to embryos or embryos outside of the womb. Now here, Nikki Haley is saying that we actually want more IVF clinics.
Let me make it clear. We want more IVF centers. We want these parents to have these options. We want government to allow the conversation to be between the doctor and the parents without government getting in the way on the decisions that are made about them and what happens with these embryos. So the goal is fix whatever you need to fix to keep government out of it.
All right, so that's basically the pro-choice talking point when it comes to abortion, and it absolutely does apply here. If embryos are human beings, are human babies at the earliest stage of development, as Nikki Haley said in that first clip, then why do we want more unregulated, she's saying unregulated IVF clinics, where these embryos are not protected by law? They do not have a right to life. They can be abandoned. They can be sold. They can be indefinitely frozen. They can be destroyed. They can be fodder or a volleyball in the middle of relationship problems between parents. This is what happened. Who's that actress that was on Modern Family? Sofia Vergara. That was part of what happened there. Is they had frozen embryos that she didn't want to transfer, and then the husband did. I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time. That's why I'm saying these embryos have to have rights. They have to be seen as individuals. And here Nikki Haley is saying, well, no, these human beings, they should not have a legal right to life, because she's saying the government shouldn't get in the way. So again, I would just ask her, why do you apply that logic when it comes to embryos in a lab? But you say that you're pro-life, you say that you're anti-abortion, and so should those embryos inside the womb, should they have a right to life? It's very, very confusing. And then Carrie Lake, she says 1 in 6 Americans struggle with fertility issues. In the Senate, I will advocate for increased access to fertility treatment for women struggling to get pregnant. IVF is extremely important for helping countless families experience the joy of parenthood. I oppose restriction. So again, what we are hearing from Republicans is that there should be actually an increase of frozen embryos, an increase of embryos created and placed on ice indefinitely. There should be more of this. There are already millions of frozen embryos in America, again, because we are the unregulated wild, wild west, because the reproductive industry makes so much money off of this and surrogacy and all of these things. We're already absolutely wild and an anomaly in the world when it comes to this stuff. And here you have Republicans, pro-life Republicans, who one day will say, yeah, of course, babies have the right to life. Those babies need to be protected. I'm 100% pro-life. Oh, but we need more IVF clinics. We oppose restrictions. We do not want the government to get involved. So these embryos over here, they do not have a right to life. In order to have a right to life, you actually have to have that right recognized by law. And they're saying, no, they shouldn't have a legally recognized right to life. There's so much hypocrisy and incongruence, and I don't think they're stupid. I don't. I think that they think that you're stupid. I think that's what it is. They don't want you to see that hypocrisy. They know that saying you're pro-life and pro-IVF no matter what, unconditionally, is actually a pretty popular position among a lot of people, even though it is, as I said, very incongruent. They don't want you to see the duplicitousness. Even Mike Johnson, who has said a lot of things that I agree with, especially when it comes to Christianity, he said that, yay, he's pro-IVF. Here's Sot 9.
I believe in the sanctity of every human life, always have. And because of that, I support IVF and its availability. It needs to be readily available. It needs to be something that every American supports, and it needs to be handled in an ethical manner. So we'll continue to support that. I don't think there's a single person in the Republican conference who disagrees with that statement.
Yikes. That's because most Republicans haven't thought about anything. That's just the case. Most Republicans haven't thought about anything. Most people have not thought about anything. No one, it seems, is looking at this from the perspective of this defenseless life. And I don't want it to seem like I am condemning all of you who have used IVF. I have a lot of people in my audience who have. And as I've said so many times, one, your pain of not having been able to have children naturally is real and deserves compassion and deserves empathy and deserves focus and attention. And I am sorry. I can absolutely imagine the heartbreak that it was for you month after month, seeing that negative pregnancy test, hearing from the doctor, you're not going to be able to conceive children naturally. IVF is your only available option. I imagine how difficult that was to hear. That's not what you wanted to go through. You didn't want to have to go through IVF, but you saw that as your only ticket to being able to conceive and bear a child that is biologically yours. So that's one. Two, I know that you love your children. You love your children just as much as I do, just as much as anyone else does. And three, your children are made in the image of God. They have just as much value as anyone else's children. And so all of these things are true. All of these things are true. That does not, none of these things, though, justify unfettered access to IVF. None of these things negate the ethical and moral questions that we have and should have about the process of freezing and transferring and implanting and dissecting embryos. There's still a eugenics process when it comes to testing these embryos. There is still the issue of the failure rate of transfers. There is still the entire moral and biblical issue of taking conception away from the sexual act. Again, this is something that evangelicals don't talk about a lot, but it has to be talked about. What do we always say about technology? When it takes us from what is natural to what is possible, we are obligated, especially as Christians, to ask, is this moral? Natural to possible, but is this moral? A lot of times it is, but sometimes it's not. Just because something is possible does not mean that it is moral. And I've talked to many of you who went through IVF and you are dealing with this moral quandary now, where you've got babies left on ice and you are not able to have those children yourself. You got health restrictions, whatever. And you can't bear to put those embryos on ice up for adoption because you have no control over who adopts those babies. Will it be two men? Will it be atheists? Will it be people who don't have good intentions? And those are your babies. You also can't bear to just leave them there on ice and to pay that freezer fee every month. You also can't bear to destroy them. And so what are you to do? That's difficult. It's very difficult. There are private adoption options where you can ensure that the couple is a Christian, but it's difficult. And I'm just saying, we as Christians got to start thinking about this stuff a lot more. Our Republican leaders aren't. They're not going to. So pastors, can you step up? Can evangelical pastors, can we start talking about this, please? Because your congregants are wondering, and they don't know. They don't know. Look, these are image bearers of God, and therefore they're of utmost importance to us. And we as Christians, we have always been a refuge of clarity and courage for children. We have always put an end to child sacrifice. We have always put an end to marginalizing children. The Christian order is to put the needs and the well-being of the weak before the desires of the strong and the powerful. And so often reproductive technology reverses that order. So that is why we as Christians need to care about this and talk about this. Mike Johnson, I'd love for you to come on this show and talk to me about it. Chances are he's never thought about it. Okay, I'm not indicting his character. He's probably just never thought about it. Several other Republicans are all saying the same thing. I'm sure that he is right when he says that most Republicans completely agree with him.